What do you think about Final Fantasy XVI? I don't really care about Final Fantasy anymore. To me, Final Fantasy died after 12. I mean, 12 it was already dead, but 12 it was still a great game and I really enjoyed it. But after that, every single JRPG, every single Final Fantasy game disappointed me. Even a lot of the spin-offs that have been released are kind of like not great. They aren't bad games at all, but most of them are kind of like meh, forgettable. Some of those Crystal Chronicles games, on the Wii or on the DS or PS4, I don't know. It's just, in my opinion, when you take the author of something away from that something, it dies. It goes with him. Like I said, imagine if George R.R. Martin, lost his rights for Game of Thrones. I'm not a fan of Game of Thrones at all, but imagine, if somebody else started making those books. I don't know, man. It's just, I know companies like Square Enix own the rights to the name Final Fantasy, but that's not Final Fantasy anymore. It was just, I know I sound like a purist, like an annoying fucking hipster purist, but when it comes to Final Fantasy, that's exactly how I am, I just can't stand that they're still calling Final Fantasy something that is clearly not Final Fantasy. They feel way different. Final Fantasy XII, amazing game, but it just feels completely different. That's a Yasumi Matsuno game, man. That's the guy from Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics. That's a Yasumi Matsuno game, That's not a Hironobu Sakaguchi game. And then there's Final Fantasy XIII. It just feels like, what the hell? This is not Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 15? Holy shit, man. So Final Fantasy 16 looks like it's gonna be the same, like it's gonna be something that's not Final Fantasy, It's just something completely different. They're just calling it Final Fantasy for branding purposes, to make you buy it, because it's a really extremely popular name, so they're gonna make more Final Fantasy games, even though they're not Final Fantasy. Are they great games or not? Well, that's up to you to decide, up to us. Is Final Fantasy 15 a great game? Well, I didn't like it, but I'm pretty sure a lot of people love the game. But to me, that's not Final Fantasy. But some people say the series was rebooted. We explained it. We talked about the definitions before, right? Remasters, remakes. Now let's talk about reboot. Reboot is precisely that. When the original creators of authors go away, and the developers or publishers want to continue the series, and they have to turn into something completely different. I think that's what happened with Final Fantasy. They just never used the term reboot, like they did with Tomb Raider, for example. Remember Tomb Raider? How it was rebooted, and everybody was saying this is a reboot? That's what they should have said with Final Fantasy 12. In my opinion, Final Fantasy X was the last true Final Fantasy. Then came X-2, which is garbage, but it's still a turn-based RPG based on Final Fantasy X, so it's still Final Fantasy. And then there's Final Fantasy XI, which is an MMORPG and online. Everybody did that. Phantasy Star did that, so everybody was doing it back then. Dot Hack did that. Even Shin Megami Tensei did that, so that's okay. But Final Fantasy XII came into existence, and it was something, like, people played it and were like, what the hell is this? This is not Final Fantasy. This is something completely different now. And to me, Final Fantasy, the series, was rebooted with Final Fantasy XII. So Final Fantasy XII should have been called Final Fantasy 1 Reboot.